Hello, and welcome to Leaders in Learning, a series that explores the business of learning. I'm your host, Shauna David. Thanks for tuning in. My guest today has worked for some of the world's biggest brands, from Blockbuster to Apple to LinkedIn, and then LinkedIn again. Jason has a wealth of experience in building leadership capabilities across diverse industries and sectors. He's a father, coach, and founder of his own talent development firm, and is responsible for developing leaders at LinkedIn. In this episode of Leaders in Learning, we'll dig into leadership development with him, what works, what doesn't, and the impact technology plays, and maybe even where he stands on the whole remote versus in-person work debate. Hi, Jason.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm very excited to chat with you today.
I appreciate the opportunity to come in and talk about these things that we're really passionate about.
Well, and I want to start with your background a little bit. I'd love for you to tell us about your career journey and how you got into this niche of leadership development and coaching.
But I grew up in retail, so I started at a pretty young age leading teams and in the technology space, and that transition into, working for Apple and having this exposure, to a pretty powerful company that, did amazing things and created connection for people. And through that experience and leading teams and identifying in that way with a little bit more of my purpose and what I cared about, and getting to coach people that were kind of early in career, helped me start to see that I had a little bit of a natural strength, I guess, in that space. And it provided some opportunities to do some work for them, eventually created a role for me a little bit more in the traditional space of what learning was and how you enable people to be more effective in their roles within the company. That just kind of transpired into, I think, just additional growth that I took into other opportunities from there.
Through that time, have there been like a particular concept or skill that you feel has carried you through your journey so far?
I probably didn't really understand that the way that I was showing up was something that was resonating with people at the time. But as I grew and developed and connected to the work, I think tying it back to how I showed up a little bit more, coach-like or curious in the ways that I interacted with people was like an aspect of the relationship building that helped me not just, I think, connect to, the way that we look at our growth overall and what's important to, the other person that I'm engaging with. Mm-hmm. I think that concept, was a little bit more, outside of probably what I focused on, but, something that helped me quite a bit.
It drew you to the space, it sounds like.
It did.
And one of the things we were talking about off camera was the connection between parenting and coaching. Mm-hmm. And I've heard you describe your purpose being fatherhood, but your passion being coaching. And I'm curious if there's any parallels or like principles that you see across both of those things.
I think for me, more recently, there's been this realization of, as my kids have gotten older, they're becoming young adults, and this purpose of mine and being a father and where I get a lot of fulfillment from that, comes from, I think, how I've engaged with them. Again, a realization of like, I've shown up probably more as a coach in terms of my parenting style. I say that and equate it to the fact that there's like this level of curiosity comes into play when we're coaching individuals and we're creating space for them to explore really what's possible. And there's no better person than to do that with than our kids as they're starting to really come into who they are, what's important to them, what's going to lead to their success. And so I was doing this work, I'm helping leaders develop this skill and this capability and coming back home, and it just became like a natural way that we would interact. And I found that as they got older is where there was probably more patience to engage in a lot of the questions that I was asking, and to see the value that it was creating for them, and that it was coming from a place of love, and it strengthened the relationships in a way that I think that is so powerful, for me. And I'm seeing it as I coach and work with other individuals and have these conversations. I've turned into this probably like this vulnerability machine that some people really aren't prepared for when they know me from my past and to what I'm doing now. That's helped me, I think, connect in ways that, aren't just benefiting myself personally, but I'm seeing the response, from others that can relate, which reinforces this feeling that I have and this desire, I think, to communicate that message a little bit more consistently.
Curious about how you think about like what good leadership is. Are there common things that you have found to be true with good leadership?
For me, it's always been authenticity. There's this compassionate leadership that always factors in, how important it is to establish these strong relationships and connections and where that comes from. Curiosity is at the foundation of so much of how those other two things manifest themselves. because you can't really be compassionate, like genuinely compassionate, if we don't understand what that actually means for that other person. And, being authentic, is a product of those types of questions that we're asking and seeking to understand. And are we really even listening to what people are saying to us?
It links to the vulnerability you called out, which is very much kind of, I think, in the zeitgeist more so now in the business sense, where folks are recognizing you can't get to that curious place unless you're being vulnerable.
Yeah.
You can't show up authentically unless you are willing to kind of open and be vulnerable and have those conversations. And I think the workforce is changing. Folks are looking for that more. That's not true in all organizations and for all individuals. And I'm curious, have you found that, what's the cost of bad leadership? Is there a cost?
Sometimes it's not even, I would say in some cases, just bad leadership.
Yeah.
I think it also can be misrepresentation in terms of how leaders are showing up in some ways.
Interesting.
So there can be a cost associated with a well-intended leader showing up and wanting to support their teams almost to a fault because they're rescuing and saving them from some of these painful learning experiences as a product of, I want people to like me, I want them to care about me. And when I see them start to falter or feel the pain, which typically leads to growth, I kind of jump in and almost prevent that from happening. Yeah. And by doing that, there's a cost to that because we're actually inhibiting their ability to grow in a way that actually leads towards a place where they can become more self-fulfilling and effective in the work that they do. So there's that product of it. And then there are some that is a little bit more obvious, is people that aren't necessarily, they lead from a place of one size fits all and aren't approaching, each individual in a way that is going to serve them the best, really seeking to understand. So
I really appreciate your perspective on who is a leader as well, right? This concept of leading from any chair, I think, is so important. And it sounds like that's been true in your story as well and in the organizations that you've served.
Yeah.
In the last few years, I think we can agree there's been a ton of disruption in the world, right? Folks are changing the way they work. There was this thing called the pandemic at some point, and there's so much emerging technology that's changing how people are getting work done, how we're communicating in work, but also outside of work. And so I'm curious from your perspective about that, the role of technology. How have you seen it impacting leadership development? Are there things that leaders should be doing to better use technology to manage, coach, and grow their teams?
The challenge has always been, in any organization, is the new thing. It's almost like the human desire that we have to have the new thing.
Yeah.
Right? It drives us to make decisions, and somebody might kind of force something that people aren't necessarily ready for or isn't necessarily aligning with what they need. And so, again, this always tying back to the curiosity piece is really understanding where people are spending their time. How do we integrate into that space a little bit more specifically? When we're looking at technology, what's the right option that actually is going to serve the needs of our audience overall?
That match, right? The fit between the individual, the business outcomes they're driving, the needs of the employees, and then layering in that technology as not where you're starting, but where you're ending sounds like advice that's relevant for us all as AI takes over the world, and we're figuring out how to make the most of it. Yeah. And I mean, we talked a little bit about the pandemic and that changing the way that leaders in a lot of cases relate to their team. And so do you have a hot take on remote versus in-person? Do leaders really need to be co-located with their people to, develop and coach and grow them?
I think a lot of it does tie back to where the company is in a lot of ways, and you're seeing that trend. You saw a lot of people embrace it based on what we were experiencing around the world and jumping to providing opportunities for everybody to be remote. And that's our forward-looking strategy. And then starting to pull back, little bits at a time. We'd like you to, maybe come in the office when it works for you. And then now we'd like you to come in one day a week. And, we had these days that now we want you to be in there together. So you're seeing this coming back full circle a little bit. And I think being flexible and being aware of those changes that are going to continue to happen are going to be key to people feeling comfortable with whatever that might look like, for their particular situation. My personal belief is that it can happen from anywhere. I think we proved that through these opportunities to connect in ways that we hadn't before. I think it drove a lot of personal connection, even outside of work, in ways because people were becoming more used to it, maybe in the professional sense, that they were seeing, oh, wow, I can actually build a relationship, have trust with somebody. I haven't connected with these people that are really important to me in my personal life. I can actually do that same thing. Now, at the same time, there is like a moderation to it and a balance that I think applies to all learning in general, where we can create these blended experiences for people as they're developing these skills that are really important for them to be successful. And the same thing applies from a leadership standpoint. There's benefits to doing things, in this autonomous way, to being able to connect virtually when we need to. And there's so much power to coming together and being like this. Probably wouldn't feel exactly the same if we were doing it, over a Zoom call. But finding the benefits to all of them, I think, are what creates the momentum, instead of, I think, zeroing in on the things that might not be adding as much value.
And what about in the situations where you are in an organization that perhaps is in a time of rapid change, perhaps there's disruption in the industry, and you are tasked with shifting leadership capabilities, redirecting them, instilling new behaviors? How do you tackle that?
It's interesting. I mean, there are so many companies that I think do a lot of great work up front assessing, but they sometimes will not have enough of the sample size to really be intentional with the work that they're doing and represent the voice. And they might just leave it up to a survey and use a survey and go, all right, like, we know exactly what we're going to do for the next 5 years.
I've seen that before, yes.
Yeah, those like commented results, and 4.5 out of 5, and it's like, it all makes sense. But I think what we, and maybe in some cases, have lost touch with at times, and not in every organization that I've been in, but with people that I coach, I kind of hear this come true, is they don't feel that there is space for their voice to be heard. And some people think surveys and kind of reaching out in that digital type of way, that they can gather and understand the voice. But, this is where it happens, right?
Yeah.
It's the face-to-face interaction. It's not just telling people what you want to hear, but listening to what they want to say. If we are able to show up in a way that gives people that space, and they can feel, vulnerable in the moment to talk about the things that they hold back from in these surveys, or a conversation with their manager, or, a skip level conversation with somebody more senior in the organization, it creates a connection and alignment to the other things that you actually are gathering, which does help with, again, how do you get started?
I really love how you're bringing it back to kind of the foundations that will remain true in an organization, things like values, mission, and then building leadership development. It's very connected in to those central purpose of the organization, so that it can root into the business in a sustainable way. One of the challenges I think leadership development is up against in a world where productivity matters, business is moving faster than ever, is a perception of cost center, or perhaps a bit of a challenge in how to articulate the business outcomes, like the impact to your business. So I'm curious, you mentioned surveys and, the typical, did you like it? What would you rate this course out of 5?
Yeah.
Are there other like KPIs, outcomes that we should be looking for, both to help us improve programs, but also to help educate our executive team and the organization to get their buy-in and bring them into the fold, and so they can see the power of this? What are those KPIs? From
a learning perspective, there are those consistent ones that you've mentioned overall that I think are pretty typical for people in terms of what they pay attention to up front, with employee sentiment, the questions that are being asked around how long somebody expects to stay at a company. Like, you can gauge all of those things kind of over time. Do they feel invested in? How would they rate managers, in terms of how they're showing up for their teams? All those things become really important. The ones that become a little bit more challenging, again, I think tie back to performance. And within certain organizations, like a sales organization, much easier. You're either attaining, quota, or you're not. You're either engaging with customers or you're not. You're not kind of performing against these expectations that have been laid out really clearly. And ultimately, from a leadership standpoint, more specifically, are we not just looking at how a manager thinks that they're currently showing up, or a leader feels that they're showing up? Because we might think that we're actually showing up and coaching somebody, let's say 3 times, a month. But on the flip side, are we actually having the conversation with those that they lead and seeing if there's alignment? Because in most cases, what I've found is you would ask their direct report the exact same question, and they might say, well, I'm not getting coaching at all, because there's not clarity around what those two things actually mean for the person delivering and the person receiving. And so doing more of that work where we look at both sides, I think start to create the actual real story that we're interested in, that can then be communicated back to senior leadership around the programs that are being developed. Because just looking at again, the sentiment number and all those things.
Attrition, all that stuff.
Yeah, attrition is always great too. But people leave for different reasons. I mean, I think most of us know that most people will leave when they don't feel supported, and normally it's from those that should be showing up in support and aren't.
So I want to dig in a little bit to a time in your history where some of these themes may have shown up. So there's two kind of things I want to chat with you about. One is your time at one of my favorite places, Blockbuster. That was a time, I think you were there when Netflix was starting. They were still shipping out CDs, but it was starting to disrupt the industry. Is there any way to avoid that? Are there things that leaders should be doing to be more anti-fragile? Can you avoid disruption entirely? Is that possible?
During that experience, I remember going into these stores, and they were in these kind of remote areas. I'm from Ohio.
Okay.
And so it was spread through southern Ohio, but it was always busy, and it was always like a customer and an experience overall, which is what most companies are trying to create for their consumer. And when Netflix started to come in and you started to hear the rumblings of shipping movies out and, the conversation in the stores with customers when they would talk about it, it's like, who's going to really do that? That's never going to happen. And then slowly Blockbuster started shipping CDs from their stores, realizing that that was actually happening. And then you started to see some of the streaming aspects of that and bundling these different promotions. And there was it wasn't even just an awareness that it was happening. I think everybody knew.
Okay.
It was an acceptance to it. So almost to your question around, is it inevitable? 100%, like it's going to happen.
Yeah.
And I think in that experience, I learned that that was not something that Blockbuster, their leadership, employees, even some customers would even accept, that was going to really change long-term the way that we engaged, with entertainment and content in that way.
Well, it's that human connection that we've talked a little bit about, and the tension between the digital and the physical and how that relates to the way humans talk to each other. And, I remember the time when Apple retail was really investing in what that experience is. And similar to I'm of the age where I too very much enjoyed my trips to Blockbuster because there was an experience associated to it. There was a feeling. And I know similarly at Apple, that was a really important investment. And it's not always easy to manage teams in those high stress environments. And so do you have any advice for folks who are on the floor working in a real co-located environment where you don't have a lot of control over the flow of work? What are some tips for leaders to be able to maintain how they show up in those high stress environments?
I think that, what happens for a lot of leaders, and, you and I both spent time there, and it was the most transformative time in my career for sure, just based on the company and seeing the growth, being one of the early stores and getting to open my own stores as a store leader and build teams and, the passion behind it. I didn't fully understand. Like I was always like a Windows and PC guy, and I worked at Gateway Computers. Like I never thought I'd use a Mac. When Gateway stores were failing and I saw Apple stores, I was like, oh, that's not gonna turn out well.
Okay.
Never thought I'd work for them, and it really just changed like my perspective in a lot of ways. But as a leader, more specifically, selfishly, like for me to understand what was happening, I needed to be in it and a part of it. And I think this is agnostic of retail or any industry or company.
Okay.
What happens is as we kind of grow in the ladder, because I think that's a term everybody's familiar with, into senior leadership or different levels, we become more disconnected from the experience that's happening that our people are actually driving. Yeah. And for me, I never disconnected from that. So as the business was growing and shipments were getting bigger, I would go in the back and I would help unbox and put inventory away. I would, clean different areas of the store. I would come out and engage with customers when it was busy. I would coach and be there to give feedback in the moment to understand, because it's one thing, again, to hear about a lot of these things or to see it come in a survey or feedback that customers are giving, and it's another to experience it yourself, because it grounds you in a place of, if I'm going to coach you and give you feedback, I have to come up from a place of understanding. And this ties back to these characteristics. Like, I think what I realized, that was how I operated, and it was more powerful than I understood. And, I've had great conversations with CEOs that I've been partners with at companies that I've worked at. And you see like the level of respect that they have, because they don't really ever separate. They're involved, and there's a balance to that too.
Of course, but you are hitting on something that's, lean management talks about this a lot, like going to the Gemba, being on the floor is really to your point, it creates an awareness. There's a reality check. Yeah. There's a connection to employees, and it ties back to that the way you beautifully described the ecosystem of values, behaviors, business objectives. And so, again, technology has changed that. So it's harder for some people to be close to the business. You have to be a bit more intentional, I think, as how you design your workday, your workspaces, the employee experience. And you've had a bit of a front row seat to that within LinkedIn, recognizing, I think we can both agree, it's like the most powerful social learning platform. How did that happen? What's been your experience watching that change?
After Apple, I wanted an opportunity to take these skills that I had developed, got to formalize a little bit more of the learning background and experience and facilitation or whatever it was. And LinkedIn was growing at a rapid pace in 2013. I had a chance to join and get even more exposure to what like official learning was, because I really still didn't understand it. And seeing that growth over time was pretty powerful. But I also wasn't using LinkedIn as much at the time. Like it was, I think people were getting into it a little bit more in that moment. And you can kind of track over time, like member growth was pretty significant during those years. And when you started to recognize like the power of LinkedIn and what it creates, from this connection that so many people struggled to necessarily see, and still there's an opportunity for it, because we can still see products like LinkedIn and some of their competitors are just used as job boards. Like if you ask most people, what they use those platforms for, it's like I get on there to find a job.
Yeah.
But the power behind it, and all of the social connections that you can create, the ability to share content, to create a voice for yourself, to engage in conversation around topics that are important to you, is the power of like those networks, and LinkedIn more specifically. And I think what I've noticed over time is that when you start to tap into that and really understand the personal branding and the approach that you take to that and what it can lead towards, for those that are either starting their own business or they're trying to identify with people that think in a similar way that they do, it actually generates a lot of learning moments if you see it for that. But there is this connection that has to happen for people to actually identify that those are learning moments and growth opportunities engaging in a platform like that.
I have a deep belief that learning does happen everywhere, and it's not confined to a classroom or a training in a business setting. And I appreciate that you're calling out the vast amount of knowledge available. Are there like particular people that you've learned from?
I don't know if it's, I'll be honest with you, I don't zero in like as much on that, because to your point, I think I've embraced the language around a growth mindset. Sometimes we don't pause and think about, like, even this conversation today, like, it's wonderful. And I'm going to walk away and I'm going to say, oh man, I haven't really invested in my development lately, but I had this great conversation and I learned new things about myself. First and foremost, like, what did I learn about myself? Like, how did I improve in how I communicate the message that I'm so passionate about? Like, cool, that was growth, that was learning.
Yeah.
The same thing in terms of learning something about you. And we don't necessarily pause long enough to recognize that every day throughout these moments, there's growth. And if we don't, then it's harder to refine those things that are really important.
Oh, I love that. Self-awareness. There's because this is the beauty of coaching, and I sometimes correlate, learning with sports. I am no professional athlete, but I recognize the value of that repetition. The spacing between, something that you've learned and taking time to reflect is similar to an athlete putting in the reps, but needing a rest day so that their muscle, maybe not my biceps, but my brain, can be filled with the knowledge that you are soaking in and experiencing. And
awesome.
In a recent LinkedIn post, you asked a very thought-provoking question that I'd like to flip the script and ask you. Mm-hmm. You said, and I might butcher your quote, but essentially that if you want to know someone really on a deep level, underneath the superficial stuff, ask them a couple key questions. And the question that you so eloquently wrote was, what brings you happiness? What brings you fulfillment? So Jason, tell me.
I do those videos because I just like to ask questions.
Oh, but now you have to answer them.
That's a tough question. It is a tough question. And it's one I've been asking myself for, and especially over the last year, is I think all of us go through these like points in our life of just deep transition and reflection and being introspective. And, I feel like I've felt a lot of loss over the last year in different ways, like loss of a parent, loss of a job, kids older and getting older and leaving the house. Like it's a real thing. But for me, I like that is a product of it. Like I was able to, I think, connect back to the fact that like my purpose, and we were talking about this earlier, and this connection to coaching, all is rooted in being a dad.
There's nothing wrong with family being the purpose and the center point.
And not even wrong with it, just the emotional piece that I tend to find with it is, I think, recognizing that like this fulfillment that we get comes from all these different places, and we want to attach to, I think, what most people will find to be that thing, or, you know, socially we are in these environments where we think it should be this thing.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, this is what gives me purpose. And it's naturally, I think, easy for parents to say, this is what my purpose is because I love my kids, but not everybody actually shows up in support of it.
Yeah.
And I think that there have been moments throughout my life where I haven't. I think there are moments that I've been super engaged, and the things that I've done have lended to some pretty awesome human beings that are, you know, will change the world in whatever way that actually looks. And so what makes me happy is starting to be honest, like personally, like selfishly, identifying that is the thing, and it's okay. It doesn't have to be, you know, that I've made X amount of money or that I can take all these vacations and do all these things. But I think what's giving me fulfillment is the acknowledgement of what is really important to me. And that leads to happiness because I'm feeling comfortable in being vulnerable and talking about these things and showing a little bit of emotion in situations that most people wouldn't, or I wouldn't have in the past. And if I do that on a more consistent basis, that's just feeding this internal dialogue that winds up, in my mind, not just having an impact on me, but hopefully, you know, those that I get a chance to share the story with.
As a working mom, I appreciate you calling out that really precious role, and the fact that you've been able to draw lessons from your professional life that infuse the way that you show up to what matters most. And then that flywheel back, I'm sure it has helped make you a better leader and a better father. And so thank you so much for showing up authentically and having this conversation with me. I really appreciate it, Jason. It's been a pleasure.
No, it's been great. Thank you so much.